Today we'll be covering part 1 of the 2020-09 quarterly release. And typically when we do the release webinars, I spend the first webinar or the first part of the first webinar just going over kind of the release notes, everything that's updated and changed, everything you have to know. I like these webinars to be always demoing and showing and a bit more fun and a bit more short. So this one I decided we have some interesting feature work that's in the core part of the platform, and I wanted to just jump right into giving some demos and showing what's new, because I think that's why people join these webinars. Later in the series, later this week, we'll catch up to some of the finer details. So today on the agenda, I want to show the enhanced validation APIs that were added in this release, which allows developers really greater control and makes it easier for developing better UX and better architecture around the subject of validation. So I'll just kind of walk through some demos and highlight what's new. And then later this week, we'll go through some of the package updates. So as you know, Servoy comes with many packages or extensions which you can add to projects. And so we'll go over some of the updates there. There were some nice updates to the pop-up filter component, which is one of the more popular components. And then toward the end of the week, we'll get to those odds and ends about the release. So some of the specific things in the release notes. So let's start with a demo as we always do, and then we'll go over kind of the API and overview. And again, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat window as we go along, and we'll make time for that at the end. So I'm going to switch over to, well, I think I have the IDE here. I have a very simple application that I made this morning. And we'll go over the new validation setup, and then I'll show a nicer application which gives you a bit more of a real world feel. But since this is kind of a new API, I wanted to show a very stripped down example to walk you through kind of the order everything goes in. This is the orders table from the sample data that ships with any copy of Servoy for many years now. And so what I'm going to do is walk through each part of the sort of events. The first thing that we added is a centralized way to do validation. So we added a new event which binds at the entity level, so at a database table or data source level, and is fired whenever validation is needed. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what that's like in the IDE. So this is my form here. I can show you that it's based on the data source, the orders table here, and we've added under the entity events, a new event that you'll see here. You won't see this in prior versions, called onValidate. And this gets fired at various times, and I'll explain when that happens. Take a look at the code here. When this event gets fired, it passes in obviously the record which is being validated, and a new class, a new object called record markers. And record markers is kind of like a stateful object that's sort of like the validation state of the record. And it has its own API. It's its own class. It's now JS record markers. You would see it over here if you were exploring the API in the Solution Explorer. You would see it here, JS record markers, and here's all the API that comes with that. Essentially what happens is anytime validation is going to happen, this gets passed into the validators, and you could have many validators attached to a single data source. It could be in different modules or something. In this case, we just have one. That gets passed in, and you can report problems or warnings or errors on the record itself, and then it gets passed out of the validator, and that gets handled downstream. So what this is a really nice way for, and people have been asking about this for years, for developers to kind of implement their rules and their validation logic in a place which is completely separate from the application workflow and the UI, and it's just sort of a hard rules definition which goes in one place and it's respected everywhere throughout the application. In this situation, you can see that I made up a couple of little rules here. One is that, well, I'm checking the record ship date to make sure that you're not shipping it before it was actually ordered. That would make no sense. And then you can see that we report a message, and I'll give you some code complete here on this. If I was typing this out from scratch, I would call one of these overloaded report report methods, and you can see the parameters here. And there's really a message you're going to report, the data provider about which you're reporting. That could be null too. Then there's the log level. So this would be the severity of the marker, and then there's something there called the custom object or custom state object, which could just be extra info that you want to have passed in and out. So in this case, I'm just giving the message that you can't ship it before you've ordered it, obviously, and that's an error. And then I just put some junk in here for the custom state. You could put whatever you want in there, because you could later retrieve this. You could put extra info in there. For example, I could say that this is related to both order date and ship date, because maybe in the UI I want to highlight both of those fields or something. Finally, there's an array you can put in, and this is not required, I just put it in there. This could be an I18N key, and that's actually recommended, not just for multilingual, but if you really wanted to have like codified externalized strings, that the error message that you would show would, you sort of have the code and the real display value, and you could change that without going back into the code. In this case, I just put it in directly, but this could, anywhere you show text, this could be an I18N message here, and then you could parameterize it with this argument. So, and that's true of anywhere where you show I18N messages, they can be parameterized. So that's what's going on in my validator, and then down here I have something which say is just a warning that, hey, this order total goes over $1,000, maybe the customer credit needs to be checked or something. So that goes in under a warning. So now as a developer, my job is done. I've implemented my business logic. Maybe my colleague is designing the user interface or the application workflow, and they're going to work off of this. They don't need to go about putting this in mixed in with their other business logic. So what happens? When does this get called? Well, going back to the sample solution here, it gets called whenever you are saving. So I've put a save button here. It calls the save data API call, which has been in Servoy's API since the beginning. I am also proactively calling it programmatically when there's a data change. So I'm going to make this ship date July 1st. You'll notice right away that I'm sort of printing out the validation here, that there's an error there, and it just shows me the state of the record. If I were to put it back to something later, you can see that it's instantly cleared. So I'm actually validating continuously here on data change in the form. But if I were to put this to a bad value and then try to save it, you can see that I'm popping a toaster message here that the save failed. The thing that I want to point out is this is not happening really in the form logic. This is using that validator. If I were to, well, I'll put this back to something valid and then save it, and you can see that it's successful. If I were to pick another record here, this one, the order total is over 1,000, and now already I ran the validation even on selection, and now I have this warning that it's over 1,000, credit check is recommended. That's not going to block the save. So even if I change the ship date, for example, and save this, you can see that it still updates it. The warning, any log level, less severe than error is not going to prevent a save. So let me take you back into the code here and just show you what's happening on the orders form. So you can see that, let's first look at that save method that's bound to this button. You can see that I'm just calling good old database manager save data, and that hasn't changed. That API has always returned a Boolean, and it's true if all of the data saved and false if it didn't. And then you can inspect what the errors were, et cetera. But in this case, what happens is save data will always first call the validator for records that are being saved. So by simply implementing that on validate handler, I am now routing all saves through my validator, and if I attach any errors to the record, then the save will fail. It won't be pushed to the database. So it's not just a way of putting stateful markers on a record, it's also a way of really preventing bad data from going into your database. And that happens application-wide. I don't have to proactively call it, it's just there when I call save data. And you can see that if it's false, I'm throwing that little red toaster to show you that the save failed. Now there are some folks that use the autosave mode, and if you're new to Servoy, that's the ability to just dynamically save the data anytime a user is changing the interface. This is a very productive workflow to have, although not everyone uses it because they want to have control over when data gets saved. But it is available, so let's talk about it. So here I'm enabling autosave. I just put a checkbox on this form, but that's typically an application setting you would do at the beginning. So now, when I'm automatically committing records as I edit them, what's going to happen then? Because you saw that I programmatically called save data, but here I'm not calling anything. It's just going to do it automatically. There is no code attached to that. So I'm going to go ahead and put the ship date back before the order date, and you can see that once I click out, it says save failed and ship date cannot be before order date. That is because we have added another event at the solution level. So my solution here, test validate, that I made this morning, I have the auto save failed event. This is brand new. You won't see this in earlier versions of Servoy. And if I look at this, what it does is it actually passes in an array of those record markers objects. So that could be, because I could be in a, I could be editing more than one record, or sorry, there could be more than one validator happening, and it could return this array. So I sort of iterate over the groups of markers, and then I actually get any errors that might be there. And again, you have this record markers object. It has this method get markers, and you can pass in a log level. Here I did error because I'm only interested in the errors. I could get warnings, for example, or infos, but in this case, I'm just getting the errors because those are going to block the save. And then I iterate over the errors and I sort of stick them all together. There's only one in this case, and then I put them under this toaster message. I want to reiterate here that I'm not proactively blocking the save here. That's already happened for me. I wouldn't have to even handle this event simply by implementing the validator and attaching those errors at the point of validation. Again, it's not going to save it to the database either through database manager save data or through the auto save. So I just wanted to point that out. Now, going back to our example, you may notice that it's kind of nice as I'm editing here. You can see that I'm updating the validation that I'm printing out to the screen here. So I want to show another approach you can take with these APIs. Again, in my orders form, I have this method print validation. I put a button on the form there, but I'm actually calling it proactively when there's a data change. So if you look at the events for the whole form, there's this nice event that binds to the form called on element data change. And that's fired anytime you have an input control which has a change data value. And all I'm doing is calling that print validation method. I also have a form variable which shows that marker text that I'm showing on the screen. So I clear that, and then I am programmatically calling yet another new method, database manager validate. This is brand new. You won't see this in earlier versions. And if I mouse over it, I'll get a tooltip. There's a lot of text there, but if I scroll down, you'll see the parameters. It takes a record object. You can also pass in an optional state object. So again, remember that when I was handling it, there's that optional object which can take a state. and that can be anything I want. So if there's some information that you want to make sure gets into your validator or you get back out of your validator, you can use that. In this case, I'm just passing the record. This
John,
will yes, Ivo.
Sorry, I don't want to take you out of your flow, but there is a question when you have time.
Yeah, that's fine.
You want to do it now?
Yeah.
Okay. And I think it's from somebody in Australia.
In
It
Australia.
must be very, very late there, or not? So the question is...
Well, we better answer it now then.
I know. The data validate method, will it call for all the records in the found set if you save the data without passing the record object?
Okay, I understand the question. Yep. So the question is, suppose I don't have autosave on, which is very common. Usually that's people will disable that, and I go in from, I go into this one and I set it to July 1st, so I have an error on this record, and then I go to this record and I'm also going to set this one to July 1st. So now I have these two records here, both having invalid markers saying they're invalid. So what happens to the validator? It will be called twice because it gets called per record and that gets passed in automatically. So I didn't try this, so we're going off script, but what the heck. So here it's just saying save failed because one of those, at least one of the records, was not able to be saved. But you'll see, in fact, that neither of these records is committed to the database. It will not let the record go through. I don't have a cancel button on here, but if I were to programmatically cancel it, I can sort of jump into my session here and Database Manager revert edited records. That reverts all of them. You can see the ship date here goes back to July. The ship date here goes back to July 31, and the errors are gone. So those never went in the database, and I actually programmatically canceled those edits, and that reverts them back to the way they were. So the answer to the question, short answer is yeah, absolutely. All the records that are being edited will all run through that if validators are implemented. If I didn't implement the validator, then nothing is run, of course. So it gives you a chance to really look at each record.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. So I was showing how to print the validation here. So this, again, this little box here, which is showing, hey, there's a order greater than 1,000, check your credit. That's coming off of directly from validation. So how's that getting back into the UI? In this case, I'm handling anytime there's a data change, also a record selection in this case, and I'm calling this method validate on the database manager. There you can programmatically pass in a record. Oh, I think the question might have been what goes in here. You would call this, you can't pass in a whole found set. You would have to pass in each record separately. But you can always get the edited records from a found set, so that's pretty easy. So I pass in the record here, and then I get back the validation markers object, which could be null if there's nothing returned. So if there's no markers generated, then it's null. So then I'm done. There's nothing to print. I cleared it, and then I'm done. So I return. However, I can call this markers. There's a bunch of stuff in here. Not markers, validation. Sorry. If I look at the code complete validation, there's, get markers at a level. I'll get to generic exceptions in a minute. But if I get the markers, in this case, I get markers at all levels. I don't know why when I do Zoom meetings, I get lots of tooltip cursor action here. Anyway, I get the markers and then I iterate over them. And really what I'm doing is I'm checking the marker level. So for each one of these markers, again, I'll get you code complete. So you can see this is what when I called that method report markers on the markers object, and I passed in my message and information about the data provider or this custom data object. That's carried back out of the validator now, and I can say, oh, was this an info, an error, a warning? What was the message? You can get the resolved I18N message for translations. So in this case, I'm just saying, well, I cheated a bit. I said if it's not error, it's warning, but really you'd want to check any, what is the log level error, warn, info, etc. But I'm only doing error warning here, so it's one or the other. And then I push that into my list of messages, and that's how I'm printing out warn and then what's coming from the validator here. The idea is that there's two ways to do this. One is to allow the validators to just work on save, because they will anyway, and then you could handle that in the UI, and that's typically when you call save and it fails, because it will return false. But the other way is to proactively do it and programmatically call that new method database manager.validate, pass in the record, and then you get back those validation markers. This UI here is not, typically you might show this a nicer way, and I'm going to get to that in the next example. But I have actually seen some of our customers with a very complicated invoicing system, for example. And as they're working on the invoice record, there's all kinds of information, and not all of it is breaking the invoice. Not all of it you want to prevent saving. In fact, I think it's really nice UX when you can save data which is invalid, but has problems, but you're able to report what those problems are to the user. And so these other log levels are nice for like warning or infos that it's not just preventing save, but putting errors will block the save.
We got two questions related to this, if you want to take.
Yeah, that's fine, because I'm going to switch over to another example, so it's a good stopping point.
Okay. One question is, can you show the error visually, i.e. make the input border red, for example, or can you show the error text below it?
Ivo, did you make that up for me?
No.
No, that's a real question. Okay.
Why?
That's exactly what I'm going to switch over to this other solution here and show you a more real world approach.
Okay.
Which may or may not involve a red border.
Okay. Shall I do the next one as well? Then maybe you can tackle that at the same time.
Yeah, please. Well, this is.
The question is, can you validate with each keystroke?
Can you validate with each keystroke? The technical answer is yes, you can. And I don't have a working example here that does that. There is an extension called the Key Listener extension, which you can then on keystrokes, and it can be throttled to. You can attach a handler to keystrokes, and then you could run validation. There's also something we're putting in, which is client-side validators, which could actually run client-side. I didn't do this in this webinar, but that could be another approach where if you really want to validate something, with a keystroke, you might want to have that logic running client-side. Because you're making a server-side round trip when they're typing. It depends, though. If you need access to your data model, then you need to go server-side, and we have a service for that. We use it for other stuff like our lookups component. So the technical answer is yes, but I'm not going to be able to show it in this webinar. Okay, so let me launch this. And this one has, by the way, this is our sample application, which is starting to appear in tutorials now, and we use this for some trainings and workshops and demos. So we'll probably be adding the validation to this in a standard way, where when you get the sample solution, you can actually see the way the code is used in a more framework way, rather than the very from scratch way I just showed. So in this case, I'm going to jump into my orders grid and double click on this order record. It's a little bunched at the bottom, so I'll make my screen smaller. Is that still visible, Ivo? The fields and such, or is it too small?
Yeah, I can see everything. Yeah.
Okay. So I put almost the identical rules in this solution, that the ship date should be, although this one looks like it's already got a bad ship date. I will change it and then change it back. So I'll save that record. So I have a, oh, I was looking at the required date. I'm sorry. I have an order date of July 5th. I have a ship date of September 23rd. And I have the same sort of rule that I want to not allow the ship date to be before the order date. So I'm going to put this to July 1. And in this case, this is a warning. So I've put it in sort of yellow and orange. And as I mouse over, you can see ship date cannot be before order date. Should probably say warning or something, ship date is before order date. Because I was playing around with it this morning and I originally said this is an error. This would not block me from saving. So I'm able to save the data and come back in. I didn't clear the warning here. I guess it'll show it every time, but that you could do that. But it didn't prevent it from saving. It did save. Now, suppose that order date can't be, is not cannot be empty, and it's not being specified at the database level, but in the application level. So if I click off that, you can see that that becomes red, and it says order date is required. And now, if I were to try to save it, you can see that it could not save order date is required. I'm not able to actually put that in the database, and I get a tooltip there indicating that what the error is, and also clearly it is in red with that red border. If I were to try to navigate away from here to the sort of editing framework, in this sample will say, hey, what would you like to do? I'll discard the changes, and everything goes back to the way it was. So this is taking all the same principles I just showed, but showing it in a more real-world looking solution with a little bit more enhanced UX. And I'll take you into the code there and show you what's happening. So this is the orders edit form right there. And we'll see that what I've done is actually this form is extending a base form. In fact, all of the edit forms here extend a base form, which has a little bit of, a framework or rules in this sample of how it works. But you can see that, again, that on element data change is implemented actually down in a base form. There's this base CRUD, which does it. And it looks a lot like the method I showed in the previous example, which was calling that print validation, which just dumps it onto the screen. In this case, I'm doing a bit of CSS. So the first thing I do is I take the origin of the event, so the field that was just changed, and I remove any styling that I had applied, any extra styling that I had applied with this remove style class. Then I'm calling that database manager validate method again. I was passing in, I was playing around with like element name here and passing it in, but I didn't do anything with it. That's that extra info, but just select the record. Again, if there's no markers, we're good. Otherwise, we continue down here and I check if it has errors. Then I cheated a bit here because it could have multiple errors, right? But I just grabbed the first one because I'm just playing with an example here, and I get the first error, and I get the message, and I put that in the tooltip. And again, I add that style class field invalid, which gives it some of the styling you saw. The same goes for warnings. I ask for markers at the log level warning, and I change my style class here to field warning for that if it has warnings. I guess it could have errors and warnings would go last, and that's all you'd see. But of course, you could be more nuanced in how you do it. Just to show you what the CSS looks like, although it's not really relevant to this sample. In the less file here, I put these two selectors at the top of the file. Probably best practice not to have hard-coded colors here, but to use brand colors, but I just went for it. So you can see there's the color, the border, thick border bottom that turns to red, and the background color, which turns kind of pinkish, and the same for the warning, which does the orange and yellow. So nice that you can just do a little CSS. You don't have to hard code it to any particular form. This is running on a base form. So that would apply to, on element change would apply to any form that inherits from this and any field. You could make hundreds of screens that have a nice validation workflow like this without really any extra code, except for the validator, which is the whole point, that on validate, you just centralize it. You don't have to worry about UI, UX. You worry only about business logic, and then you know your data is safe. Probably the last thing to show here, because we're getting long on time, is the save and the toaster, even though we kind of already saw that. But in this case, the base CRUD, if I look at the outline here, where's my outline? Now all my GoToMeeting stuff is in the way. I'll just scroll. There, save. So this is being called when I click that green apply button. Again, Database Manager save data is the way you always save. So you get that validate for free because it's returning false. And we know it returned false, then we get in and grab those validation markers. I didn't point this out earlier. I didn't have an example of this, so it's worth pointing out that whenever save fails, you can have an array of failed records. So this is typically how you would respond, and this goes back many versions of Servoy. Database Manager get failed records, which gets an array of records which could not be saved. But now there's this property on JS record that's been added, dot record markers. And if I jump in here and ask for code complete, you'll see it. It's taking a minute. There we go. So you can see there's the JS record markers object, which is attached to every record. So any record has like the stateful record markers object, or can have it, and it follows it around until that record's been revalidated again. So that's all added into this new API. Again, I get the errors there, and I put them in the toaster message, same as before. But worth pointing out that I grabbed the failed records from the save data. In this case, I cheated and grabbed the first one, but you could go through, I could be editing, I could make an order, I could add some line items, and then I could save, and I might have 10 errors with that. And if you had a nice way to show those to the user, they would be all in your transaction there. So I see some other questions coming in, so I will, I did want to go over a review here. I know we're getting long and I have a few slides, but just to make sure this is clear.
Do you want to do the questions before you do the slides?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Because there's some stuff I didn't show that I want to mention.
Okay, yep. There's somebody that's asking where the field is that caused, sorry, I'll just read it. I missed where the field that caused the error is stored or kept.
Say that again?
I missed where the field that caused the error is stored or kept.
The field that caused the error.
Yeah.
So the error itself, maybe, like the error text. I showed that at the beginning, and maybe I'll point it out again because it's kind of the root of everything here, is it attaches to the entity. So if I look at in this case, the orders table.
Yeah, so Wim says like the order date instead of the whole record. Does that make more sense?
In terms of showing it or in terms of validating it?
It's a good question.
So just to cover the original thing, there was this event, and this happens at the entity level. And this says, this attaches the errors when that gets validated. There's the ship date one there. And then it got rendered in the base form here, and it was generic. It didn't say go specifically to this field. It actually responded to the element that was in it's down here, the on element data change. So this event itself has a source. And so I did event get element name, and then the field is element name. You could also do event.get source. It will return the same object. So I'm working kind of implicitly. I never said go to this field here. I'm just saying whatever You could do that because you could get the error markers, and then there's also a data provider or extra info that you pass, which could also be used. So there's a lot of ways to kind of triangulate which field or fields, because I might want to show order date and ship date, and maybe I want to pull that off the validation markers and show it that way. So there's a number of ways to triangulate maybe which field you're talking about, and some things might not even be related to a field. They might be, you know, something a bit more complex or harder to describe.
Yep, he says he got the answer. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Other questions?
Yeah, there's one more. Can you combine the validation with validation rules that come from the database? And would that make sense?
Yeah, okay. So I think I get the question. So it could be that you want to abstract this a bit. I have my, and you'll see this in older RAD tools, I have here my onValidate, which is the handler, and this is some code here that I wrote, and this gets called anywhere validation is happening. But it could be that I want to abstract this a level further and say, hey, I want to have some rules, and I want to allow, you know, non-developers to put in a few rules and have even like a rules builder where I have, you know, you'll see this in ERP applications where they might say you can have up to 3 decimal places, or you know, the limit that I did the credit check recommended, right? When an order was over $1,000, often you'll see like in ERP systems, those will be custom rules that the tenant for the ERP system sets, not the developer. And in those cases, you want to pull that from metadata. And of course, Servoy has a fully robust business logic layer and data binding and all of those things you could be pulling from data. And that's probably what would happen in the real world. Other questions?
Nope, that's it for now.
Nope. Okay. Then just cover a couple other things. Again, why is this updated, and why would you use it? Everything I showed could always have been done in Servoy. Just it was a bit more cumbersome, a bit more moving parts. So why do it this way, and why change this now? First of all, it supports really good architecture. You could see that the validation is completely separate from the application workflow and the UI and the UX. Moreover, as the last question pointed out, you could abstract that even further and start to really put rules into, because it's not really logic, it's more like rules, and put those rules into metadata and have a metadata-driven rules and have a standard UX that reflects those and have them separate. So it's really good architecture. It makes it easier to build like frameworks that do that sort of thing. You saw I did it a little bit with form inheritance, but you can imagine on a bigger scale. And it also allows you to have your UI or UX driven from the rules. So those validation messages, those are coming right out of the rules. I don't have to, like, in my form code say if this, you know, show this. And again, I recommend those use I18N so you can you know, codify them even further and not have them be loose text. The main center of everything I showed is this onValidate method or event. It gets called anytime that you're saving, and it also gets called anytime you proactively call validate. Again, you're always validating one record at a time from a data source, and you can at any point append markers to it. And these are sort of like the validation state, you know, errors, infos, warnings. They have their own level for that. When you're saving, it gets called automatically, but there is another API that we added called Database Manager Validate. You pass in that record object and it'll get validated. You can also pass in an optional state again if you want some extra info to go on. So that's a new API. So that's a programmatic way. You saw when I was doing the on data change handler, that's when I was calling the validate because I hadn't yet tried to save it. There's a new class we saw there. You can see it in the Solution Explorer. If you expand that and click on it, there's actually two of them. There's JS Record Markers and then JS Record Marker, which is like an instance of it. So this is kind of like the outer class, which collects all the markers for a given record, and then the inner class, which is the individual marker. The individual marker has the message and the sort of severity level, plus the data provider that may have been affected. The severity levels you would want to use are errors, infos, and warnings. And the message itself can always be localized or internationalized. And of course, anytime you're doing that, you can also parameterize it so that it's flexible. I recommend that you use I18N so that you don't have developers making choices about what text a user might see, because someone from business might come along and say, oh, can you change it from ship date, instead of cannot, must be, must not, and then oh geez, you got to go back to the source code and change it. You would rather put in an I18N key and then say, oh yeah, we'll just go into the configuration and change the translation for that key. It doesn't have to be multilingual. That's a best practice. I made a little diagram so you could kind of see that all validation is passing through, all saving is passing through the validator. So you do not get to the database without passing through the validator if you've implemented the validator. And if the validator attaches one or more errors to the record, or I should say if any of the validators, because you can attach more than one from say different modules, if any of them returns one or attaches one or more error, then you get a failed save. In the case where you're calling save data programmatically, which is I think the more frequent case where people have like save buttons and they're not auto saving, then save data returns false as it always has, and then you can go and grab the failed records and look at their record markers, look at their validation state. And I showed one example of that. For other applications where you do have autosave, then we added this event, this on autosave failed, and so that's like a callback anytime where you're like clicking out of a field and all of a sudden you thought autosave would work, but validation failed. Again, it passes in the markers to that. I showed a quick example of how you can handle that as well. So those are two new additions. The other way that this could happen is that you have someone entering data in the UI. Again, you're calling that validate method, and I call this sort of the on-demand or programmatic. This is not tied to save necessarily, because on the one hand I called save data, but here I could at any point just say, hey, validate. I haven't tried to save it yet, but I might want to give feedback to the user. You saw that I did this on data change, and then I was able to highlight the field with a red border or what have you. So there's the third model there. Some things I didn't get to that I think are worth covering, and I'll just do this really quickly. Of course, some errors are not validation. Some errors happen after you've tried to save, right? And these are typically like database constraints, like a unique constraint violation or non-null violation. We've always handled those before. They fail to save, and you go and you get the record, and it gets attached to the exception. Now we're taking those and we're writing them back into the validation markers, the record markers class. You'll see a method there called get markers, but there's also get generic exceptions. So, and again, this will get all of them. So you might see stuff coming back from the database. It wouldn't matter to the person who's designing the UX. They could just check for errors, and they could check for generic exceptions that could be coming from the database. And maybe for those, they might just say unexpected error or something like that, because it's not really meant to be reported directly to a user like a database error. And that gives you the nice flexibility to handle those differently. Null empty values. So these are columns on the table which we don't allow null. You'll see that in the table editor. This is something Servoy has always enforced. So this is set again. This is at the application level, at the metadata level, to say we won't allow null. Servoy's always enforced those, but now we actually route those back and attach them as markers. And what we do is we use an I18N key for the message. So it's an error with a message, and the message I think by default says the data provider cannot be null, and it names the data provider. But it's an I18N key, so of course you can go and put in whatever you want, and then you can also parameterize it. So again, it doesn't force you to some standard message. What about custom column validators? I think I missed something. I thought I had size in there. Oh, I did that out of order. Yeah, here. There's also the size validators. So suppose you have a column with a length, 30, and you try to pass in a piece of text which is 50. That will also fail. We validate this in advance. We always have, but now again we route this through and put it on the markers. And there's again a generated I18N key which you can replace with whatever you want. So now it's really nice as a UI developer. You can just say, hey, what are my errors, and report them all as such. But the logic is all handled for you in one place. And then finally, what happens to custom column validators? This is a feature that we've had for many years. It's not the most common feature, but people do attach these method handlers for validation events on columns, which we put in the platform many years ago. Those always were executed immediately, either from the UI or even programmatically the moment it was set on the record. Now what we've done is we've deferred those. They do not execute automatically until you save them, until you save the record. There is a configuration to bypass this, because this could be, we realize this could be a breaking change, right? If you've built your application, you're expecting column validation to fire immediately, and it no longer does, then you might want to just go and change it's in the documentation. I didn't put it up here. There's a configuration you can set. But I think that if you're not using them, then this is much nicer, because what you can do is implement custom column validators if you want separately, and then they get deferred until the end, and they go back onto the markers that way. So just want to point that out. It could be a breaking change if you use validators. You want to take a closer look at that part. I'm going to take any more questions we have. I'll leave some links up here. Again, this is recorded. We'll post it at that Tech Series homepage later today or tomorrow. You can download the latest release candidate. There's instructions on our forum, so I would go there first, because there's like release notes, links, and helpful stuff there. And you can download it and try it out. Any more?
Cool. Well, first of all, people are noticing the clip art that you're using, specifically the 3.5-inch floppy drive. So we want to see more of that on Wednesday and Friday.
Okay.
Then there's also a serious question. Will the onValidate also call the column validation rules which are defined on the table columns?
Yes, I think so. I'll double check that, but I'm pretty sure it gets deferred, but then if you call validate or save, then it gets executed. So in fact, yeah, I'm sure, because I'm remembering now that they go last. So it actually goes in the order that I presented. It'll do your validator, then it'll do all the built-in stuff like the size the null validators, the size validators, and then the custom validators. And then everything gets routed back onto those markers, and you can handle them in the UI accordingly.
Cool. All right, I think that's it, Sean, in terms of, wait, there's one. Yep, no. That was it in terms of questions. Thanks for the webinar, Sean, as always. Thanks everybody for joining, and we'll see you Wednesday, same time, same place. Yep,
we'll be back Wednesday with all the extensions, the packages that are updated, the pop-up filter mainly.
All right. Awesome. All right. Have a good Monday, everybody. And see you on Wednesday. Bye.